Hercule Poirot and the Case of the Shattered Cameo. Chapter 1. A Cameo in Pieces. There are days when even the most rational minds cannot help but feel the pull of omens, those curious stirrings in the air that whispers something is about to change. I recall one such morning vividly, gray and sharp, with a mist that clung to the cobbles outside Whitehaven mansions, as if London itself had paused to watch what would unfold. Hercule Poirot was finishing his second tisane of the morning, adjusting the placement of his napkin with meticulous precision. I, his ever-dutiful friend Captain Hastings, was only halfway through my coffee, distracted by the dullness of the times and the equally dull prospect of another uneventful week. "Poirot," I said, folding the paper into feet, "surely you must admit it, nothing is happening in the world today." Poirot did not look up. He dabbed at an invisible crumb on the corner of his plate. "Au contraire, mon ami," he said mildly, "something is always happening. One must only possess the little gray cells to perceive it." I chuckled. "And what do your little gray cells perceive this morning?" "That our post will be 5 minutes late," he said, glancing at the mantel clock. "And that the woman who steps through that door within the hour will not have come for pleasantries, but for fear." I was about to ask what he meant, when, precisely 5 minutes later, the bell rang. Miss Lemon, ever prompt, appeared with a card on a tray. Poirot took it, examined the edges, and raised an eyebrow. "Madame Celeste Dulac," he read aloud, "of the Théâtre du Lys, a name known to those who follow the French stage." He adjusted his cuffs. "Show her in, Miss Lemon." Moments later, our visitor entered. She was striking tall, dark-haired, with the poise of a woman used to stages and gazes alike. But her expression was far from theatrical. "It was taught with concern, Monsieur Poirot," she said with a slight bow. "I have come to you because I believe something dreadful is about to happen." Poirot gestured for her to sit. "Tell me everything, madame, from the beginning, if you please." She sat, smoothing her gloves with careful fingers. "It is about a cameo, an old one, carved ivory, set in a silver locket. It belonged to my mother, and before her to my grandmother. It has always been a token in our family. Not valuable, but sentimental, and, if you will indulge me, a little superstitious." "Go on," Poirot said gently. "Last night it was shattered, not dropped, not cracked from age, deliberately crushed. I blinked. How can you be sure? It was in my dressing room at the theater, locked in a private drawer. And when I returned after the final performance, it had been broken and placed on my mirror, so I would see it at once." Poirot leaned forward, fingers steepled. There was no sign of forced entry. None. Only the locket, opened, its ivory face shattered, and the pieces arranged in a perfect circle on the mirror's edge. She paused, glancing down, and on the glass, in lipstick, a single word, "Souvenir." A chill prickled my neck. Poirot remained still, though I saw the quick flash of something in his eyes. "You took nothing else? No money, no jewels? Nothing else was touched, only the cameo? And have you any idea who might have done such a thing?" She hesitated. There are tensions at the Théâtre du Lys, rivalries, jealousies, but this feels older, more personal. Poirot nodded once. "You said the locket is not valuable, not in terms of money, but it is connected to my family, to my mother's past. She used to speak of it only in whispers. Your mother is still living? She died 5 years ago, but before her death she warned me. If the cameo ever broke, it would mean something was coming, something that could not be stopped." She flushed slightly. "I know it sounds absurd, but I felt it, Monsieur Poirot. Whoever did this meant it as a message." Poirot stood and walked to the window. "Tell me, madame, has anyone unusual come into your life recently? A new admirer? A shadow at the théâtre? A change in your surroundings?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, a man. He has come to every performance this season. Always sits in the third row, never applauds, never speaks. He leaves the moment the curtain falls. Do you know his name?" "No, but he leaves a single white carnation each time." Poirot turned. "Madame Dulac, would you permit me to visit the théâtre this evening?" "Of course. I would be grateful," he bowed. "Then we shall observe, and perhaps the man in the third row will give us our first true clue." As Madame Dulac departed, Poirot turned to me, his expression unreadable. "A shattered cameo, a silent admirer, and a cryptic warning," I said. "A strange cocktail, indeed." "Strange, yes," Poirot agreed, but also carefully composed. I frowned. "You think this was more than a message, I think," Poirot said slowly, "that the cameo is not the beginning of a story. It is a reminder of one already underway." That evening we arrived at the Théâtre du Lys. It was a grand but aging venue, tucked behind Covent Garden, filled that night with theatre-goers in search of drama. But Poirot was not watching the stage. He was watching the audience. And when the final act fell, his gaze fixed on a figure in the third row, a man in a dark coat who rose without clapping, walked without haste, and left a single white carnation on his empty seat. Poirot followed him. I trailed behind, my pulse quickening, but when we reached the alley outside, the man was gone. No sound, no footsteps, only the faint scent of carnation in the fog. Poirot stood still, his face sharp with focus. "It begins," he murmured. "What begins?" He turned to me, and in his eyes I saw something rare. Urgency, Murder Hastings, not yet committed, but promised. Chapter 2. A Face in the Mirror. The following morning, Poirot and I returned to the Théâtre du Lys, not as patrons this time, but as investigators. Madame Dulac had arranged our access, and we arrived just after 10, when the theatre's corridors were still shrouded in half-light, and the scent of grease paint and old velvet hung like a ghost in the air. Poirot paused in the lobby, his gaze drifting slowly across the high-domed ceiling and the aged chandelier overhead. "You see, Hastings," he said softly, "the theatre is a house of illusion, but illusions must be crafted with precision, just like lies." I nodded, though I could not help but glance around nervously. There was something about theaters in daylight that unsettled me, like seeing a magician without his costume, or a dream with the edges frayed. We were greeted in the foyer by a harried man in a cravat, too tight for comfort, and spectacles perched precariously on the tip of his nose. "Mr. Poirot, Reginald Venn, theatre manager. Madame Dulac told me you'd be coming." I must admit I'm surprised. She believes someone crushed a trinket to send her a message. Poirot offered a small, courteous bow. "It is often the smallest gestures, monsieur, that signal the gravest intentions. Might we examine her dressing room?" "Of course. Right this way." As we walked, Venn continued in a hurried, anxious tone. "She's quite popular with the public, you know, our Celeste, but not with everyone backstage. She draws attention, draws roles, draws envy." "Envy?" I asked. "Certainly. The ingenue Miss Ingram, for example. Quite the rising talent. But she's been in Celeste's shadow since she arrived. And, of course, there's our leading man, Claude Marchand." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A rival in admiration." Oh, more than admiration, I suspect, Venn said with a sigh. Though who can say where admiration ends and obsession begins? We reached Madame Dulac's dressing room. Venn unlocked the door and allowed us in. The space was modest, though adorned with soft lighting, faded roses in a vase, and a long mirror framed with bulbs now unlit. Poirot moved to the vanity and examined the glass. "You see the smear here, Hastings? The faint curve where lipstick once spelled souvenir? It was barely visible now, but the outline remained." Poirot then knelt to examine the drawer. He ran his fingers along the inside edge, pausing at a faint groove near the back. "This is where she kept the cameo," he said. "See, the dust pattern, undisturbed until recently." He looked at the floor next, scanning carefully. Then, suddenly, he straightened and crossed to the back corner of the room where the wood paneling met the wall. "There is a hairline crack here, a panel perhaps, something hidden behind the walls. Do you think the intruder came through there? Possibly. The theaters of this age are full of hidden corridors and false backs. Let us speak to those who know them best." We left the dressing room and re-entered the main corridor, where we nearly collided with a young woman balancing a stack of costumes. She gasped and nearly dropped them, then blinked in recognition. "Oh, I didn't know anyone was using the dressing room." Then introduced her. "Miss Ingram, Evelyn Ingram, our new soprano, Mr. Hercule Poirot, and Captain Hastings." Evelyn offered a polite smile, but her eyes held caution. "You've come about this incident?" she said. "You know of it?" Poirot asked. "It's all anyone talks about backstage. You can imagine the shattered locket, the lipstick message. It's like something from one of our productions." Her voice was light, but I sensed a tremor behind it. Poirot studied her closely. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did you know Madame Dulac's locket had any significance?" She hesitated. "She wore it always, spoke of it like a charm, but I assumed it was romantic, not ominous." Poirot inclined his head. "And last night, you did not see a man leave the theater early? Third row, white carnation?" She frowned. "I left through the stage entrance, but I saw no one unusual. Claude, Mr. Marchand, offered me a lift home. I declined. He was in one of his moods." Poirot arched an eyebrow. "Moods, mademoiselle?" she sighed. "He's mercurial. When the audience cheers for Celeste, he takes it personally, even off stage." She gave a dry smile. "Especially off stage?" Poirot thanked her and turned back to Venn. "I would like to speak to this Monsieur Marchand, if you please." Venn led us to the green room, a lavish but faded space, filled with armchairs, music stands, and half-finished cups of tea. Claude Marchand stood by the fireplace, his reflection caught in a wall-length mirror behind him. He was striking, tall, chiseled, dressed in a dark suit that clung too deliberately to his form. He turned as we entered and offered a nod with the forced charm of an actor halfway through a scene. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "Come to unearth backstage intrigues?" Poirot smiled. "Perhaps, or perhaps to untangle a tragedy before it occurs." Marchand's smile faltered. "You speak as though something has already happened." Poirot stepped closer. "Monsieur Marchand, were you here last night, after the performance?" "For a time. I had a drink in the green room, then left." "Alone?" Marchand hesitated. "I offered Evelyn Ingram a lift, but she refused." "I walked out past the front lobby, hailed a cab. You may ask the porter." Poirot nodded slowly, "And the white carnation." Marchand blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Poirot's voice was soft. The man in the third row, the one who leaves a carnation each night. Do you know him? Marchand's smile returned, but it was thinner now. No idea. Sounds dramatic. Fitting for our crowd. Poirot's gaze lingered a moment longer. Then he turned. Merci, monsieur. That will be all. As we left the green room, I leaned in toward Poirot. Do you believe him? Poirot was silent for several steps. Then he said, I believe he is a man used to being seen, and he does not like seeing others seen more. We returned to the dressing, room 1, final time, before departing. Poirot stood once again at the mirror, gazing into its silvered surface, as if it held more truth than any words spoken that day. He placed one fingertip against the glass. A mirror reflects Hastings, but it does not judge. It shows us only what we are willing to see. And what do you see? Poirot stepped back. I see a cameo, crushed not for sentiment, but for warning. And I see a woman who fears her past, because it is no longer in her control. He turned to me then. The question, mon ami, is not who broke the locket. It is why now. And in his voice, I sensed the answer was already forming, quiet as a whisper behind the curtain. Chapter 3. Shadows Behind the Curtain. It was mid-afternoon when we returned once more to the Théâtre de Lys. Poirot had requested privacy in Madame Dulac's dressing room for precisely 1 hour, and during that time I wandered the corridors of the theatre alone, familiar now with the groan of the old wood and the musty scent of velvet worn down by decades of applause. When I rejoined him, I found him not examining the room's contents as I expected, but seated cross-legged on the floor before the mirror, his eyes narrowed, brow furrowed in concentration. "What in heaven's name are you down there?" I asked. Poirot did not look away from the floorboards. "My dear Hastings, I am conducting an experiment in psychology. Come, look." I stepped forward and saw that he had scattered the tiny fragments of the shattered cameo on a handkerchief laid atop the carpet. "You see," he said, "they were arranged on the mirror deliberately, a circle perfectly formed, but someone stood here to place them, and the mirror would have reflected their face while they did so." Oh, I considered that. A sort of message to themselves? "Non," Poirot said. "A performance. As with all things in the theatre, the effect is everything, but it is the angle I consider most intriguing." He rose, dusting his trousers carefully. Whoever placed the pieces did not linger. They worked quickly, precisely. That tells us they had access familiarity with the space, and confidence they would not be caught. Someone backstage. Exactly. We exited the dressing room and walked into the wings of the stage where preparations for the evening's show had already begun. The curtain was still drawn, but the set had been partially constructed. An elegant parlor scene dressed in period furniture and backlit with sepia gels. The illusion of wealth, of calm, deceptively serene. Poirot paused. "Tell me, Hastings, do you recall the man from last night? The one with the carnation?" "Of course. He sat in the third row, alone. Slipped out the moment the curtain fell." "Yeah." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And yet none of the actors or stage hands seemed to know of him. No name, no inquiry, no interaction. Curious, n'est-ce pas?" I frowned. "You think he's not merely an admirer?" "I think he may be no admirer at all." At that moment a low voice interrupted us. "You're not the first to wonder about the man with the flower." We turned to see a slender figure emerge from the shadows. He was perhaps in his 60s, with a stooped frame and long fingers stained, faintly with ink. His jacket was worn but clean, and his eyes, pale and glassy, watched us with faint amusement. "I'm called Felix. I manage the props. Been here since before the war." Poirot inclined his head. "Monsieur Felix, you say? You know of the man?" "I've seen him," Felix said, leaning against a stack of crates. "Not just this week, for months. He always comes on nights Madame Dulac performs. Same row, same flower. Always leaves the moment the lights go down." Poirot gestured gently. "And you have never spoken to him?" "No one has, not even the box office staff. He buys his ticket through the post, cash only. Requests the same seat, third row, center left." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "That is very precise." Felix nodded. "There's more. I once caught a glimpse of him outside after a show. He wasn't alone." Poirot stepped closer. "Ah?" He was speaking to a woman, middle-aged, dark veil, the sort of woman who doesn't want to be seen. They argued, quietly but sharply. And then she walked off, and he didn't follow. Poirot's face darkened with thought. "Did Madame Dulac ever mention anyone fitting that description?" "Miss, to me," Felix said. "But she's been nervous of late. You can feel it in her voice when she sings, like she's looking over her shoulder." Poirot thanked the old man and returned to the lobby with me in tow. "You see, Hastings," he said, "now we are close to the heart of it." "Of what, exactly?" "Of the reason the Cameo was destroyed." We passed by the ticket counter, and Poirot paused. "Pardon, mademoiselle," he said to the young woman behind the glass. "Could you retrieve the box envelope for Set3C from last night?" The girl hesitated, then stepped back and flipped through a folder. She returned a moment later with a cream-colored envelope marked 3C. Inside was the stub, clean, uncreased, never torn. Poirot murmured. The girl looked uncertain. He didn't pass through the main entrance. If he used the ticket, he came in through the east side, through the stage corridor. "Merci." We left the building and stood on the pavement. Poirot removed a small notebook and jotted a few words. "You think he has access through the back?" I asked. "I think he is part of the theater," Poirot replied. "Or was. That is why no one questions him. He belongs and does not belong, like a ghost, returned to watch a play that no longer remembers him." We returned to Whitehaven Mansions just as the fog began to fall once more. Inside, Poirot set the fragments of the Cameo on his desk and began rearranging them piece by piece, like a mosaic. "There is something else here," he murmured, "a connection not yet seen." I sat across from him, watching the concentration in his expression. "Poirot," I said quietly, "do you think Madame Dulac is in real danger?" He looked up. "She is already in danger, Hastings, but she does not know from whom." He placed the final fragment, a curl of ivory that resembled the edge of a face, beside the others, and stepped back. "There," he said. The image was incomplete, but now the carving's features were clearer. Not a nameless figure, as I'd assumed, but a woman's profile, with hair swept back and a distinctive brooch etched beneath the neckline. Poirot tapped it. This was no anonymous cameo. This was a likeness. Realization dawned. "You mean the carving was of someone Madame Dulac knew?" "No," Poirot said. "Of someone who knew her, perhaps intimately, and who believed she had forgotten." He stood abruptly. "I must speak to her again. Tonight I rose as well. Shall I come?" "No, mon ami. I must go alone." He retrieved his coat and left with haste. his figure vanishing into the fog, just as the bells of St. Martin's tolled 6. I remained behind, staring at the fragments left behind. And though I did not yet know why, I could not shake the impression that somewhere in the pattern lay not just the face of a woman, but the face of the one who had shattered her. Chapter 4. The Visitor in the Fog. The fog had thickened to a velvet weight by the time Poirot arrived at Rue Montaigne, the narrow crescent in Kensington, where Madame Celeste Dulac rented a modest but tastefully appointed townhouse. It stood behind a low wrought-iron gate and was half swallowed by ivy, its front lamp casting a weak halo into the mist. Poirot was ushered in by a maid who spoke barely above a whisper and offered him tea in a delicate porcelain cup. He barely touched. Madame Dulac joined him in the parlor moments later, dressed not in her usual silks, but a grey robe, her face free of the stage's paint and powder. Without the artifice, she looked older, less like a star, and more like a woman pursued by something she could not name. "I'm grateful you came, Monsieur Poirot," she said, sinking into the settee across from him. "I've felt uneasy since we last spoke." "That is because, Madame," Poirot said gently, "you are being hunted." Her eyes flicked toward him, startled. Then she lowered them. "By whom?" she whispered. "That is what I intend to discover. But first you must help me by answering without omission, without polish. As if you were not performing, but confessing," she nodded. Poirot leaned forward, fingers steepled. "The cameo, Madame Dulac. It was not merely a keepsake. It was a likeness." Her eyes widened. "Yes, you're right. Of whom?" "My mother," she said softly, "when she was young. It was carved from a photograph by a traveling artisan. My grandmother had it commissioned just after my mother's engagement." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Engagement? To a man she never married, a man she later refused to speak of. I never knew his name, only that something went terribly wrong. And you believe the cameo's destruction relates to that history?" She nodded. "I never mentioned it to anyone. But now, someone must know. Someone from then." Poirot tilted his head. "You said previously your mother died 5 years ago. Before that, was she ever contacted by someone from her past? Anyone unusual? A visitor? A letter?" Madame Dulac hesitated. "There was one letter. I found it among her things after she passed. It was unsigned, just a date and a phrase. To Asmonti." "You lied?" Poirot translated. "Yes, I never understood it. Do you still have it?" She nodded and rose, disappearing briefly into the next room. She returned with a slim envelope, yellowed at the corners. Poirot took it gently and examined the paper. No return address, no handwriting on the front, only the date. June 12th, March 1902. And the phrase, "To Asmonti," scrawled across the page inside. This was not mailed, he said. This was hand-delivered. She said nothing, and the silence confirmed his suspicion. Poirot stood. "Madame, I must ask something unpleasant. Did your mother have a child before you, or lose one?" She looked away. "There were rumors among the older members of our family. My grandmother called it the season of sorrow. My mother never confirmed anything, but she wept sometimes in her sleep." Poirot's gaze narrowed slightly. "I believe someone has been watching you. I believe someone feels betrayed. Not by you, but by the woman in that locket." Madame Dulac clutched her arms around herself. "You think this is revenge?" "I think," Poirot said. "This is legacy." A knock rang suddenly at the front door. Poirot turned. Madame Dulac looked alarmed. "I'm not expecting anyone." The maid appeared, eyes wide. "Madame, There is a gentleman outside. He says he has come to return something. Poirot stepped forward. Ask him his name. The maid vanished. Moments passed. Then she returned, voice unsteady. He says he is called no one. Poirot's face darkened. Do not open the door, he said quickly. But they were too late. A crack of hinges, a chill of air. And a man stepped into the entryway. He was tall, lean, dressed in an overcoat the color of ash. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and he wore a brimmed hat, low over his forehead. In one hand, he held a small envelope. He looked first at Madame Dulac, then at Poirot. I have no quarrel with you, he said to Poirot. His voice was flat, as though stripped of emotion. Poirot took a step forward. And yet you bring it to her doorstep. The man ignored him and turned back to Madame Dulac. You forgot. That was your sin. She began, but the man raised a hand. She forgot what was owed. And the past, madame, always collects. Poirot placed himself between them now. You will explain yourself, at once. The man stared at him, and for the first time something shifted in his face. Not anger, but grief, stretched tight as canvas. I came to return what was taken, he said, and with that, he placed the envelope on the table and turned. Without another word, he stepped back into the night and was gone. Madame Dulac collapsed onto the settee. Poirot reached for the envelope. Inside was a photograph, creased, faded, but unmistakable. A young woman, the same face as the one in the Cameo, holding an infant in her arms. Behind her stood a man, his features obscured, but his presence looming. There was a second note. Je suis revenu. Pour elle, pour toi. I have returned. For her, for you. Poirot folded the photograph carefully and slid it into his pocket. We must act now, he said, before this past becomes your future. Later, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot laid the photograph on his desk and stared at it long into the night. I had returned before him and found him like this, still as a statue, his brow furrowed with uncommon weight. What does it mean? I asked. He did not answer at first. Then he said, It means we are no longer dealing with a message. I frowned. Then what? He turned to me. We are dealing with a claim. A claim? Poirot tapped the photograph. This man, he believes he has lost something. He believes she took it. And now he returns not to threaten, but to collect. Chapter 5. The Man Called No One. It was just past 7 the following morning when I found Poirot already awake, fully dressed, and seated at the breakfast table, reading the letter once more, the one left by the man in the fog. He barely touched. His tea. Good morning, Hastings, he said softly, not looking up. You slept well. Well enough, I replied, though truthfully I dreamt of shattered ivory and misted faces, of a woman weeping behind a curtain that never rose. And you? He gave a slight smile. I do not require sleep when I have mystery for company. Poured myself coffee and sat across from him. So, this man, this no one, who is he? That, my friend, Poirot said, tapping the envelope with a delicate fingertip, is the question I intend to answer before someone else ends up dead. I paused, startled. You think he's capable of... Poirot raised a hand. Let us not assume violence. Not yet, but we must assume desperation. He has waited a long time, too long, for an answer he believes was stolen from him. He stood abruptly. And desperate men are dangerous. Our first visit was to the registry. office in Kensington. Poirot had phoned ahead, requesting access to birth and baptismal records from the 1880s through to 1902. He was ushered into a small reading room by a clerk with horn-rimmed spectacles and an air of confused deference. Madame Dulac's mother was born Aimée Lavergne, Poirot explained. I seek any records of a child born to that name, or any variation thereof. It took some time. Dust-laced tomes were fetched from the archives, pages turned delicately under gloved hands. After 45 minutes, Poirot paused over a single line. "There," he murmured. I leaned in. The entry read, Clara Lavergne, born 2nd March 1902. Mother, Aimée Lavergne. Father, not listed. Baptized, St. Vincent's Parish, Clerkenwell. But Madame Dulac's name is Celeste, I said. Indeed, she was born in 1905, which means Clara came first, then vanished from the family record. Poirot sat back in his chair, eyes shining now with quiet intensity. There was a child before Celeste, hidden, erased perhaps, but not forgotten. We left the registry office, and Poirot hailed a cab. St. Vincent's Parish, he said, Clerkenwell. The church was a modest stone building tucked between brick tenements and a shuttered hat shop. Inside, it smelled of incense and wood polish, the air still and reverent. A priest greeted us. Father Bellamy, a man of kind eyes and wary caution. Yes, I recall the Lavergne name, he said after Poirot explained our inquiry. Clara was baptized here, but she did not grow up in the parish. What happened to her? Poirot asked. Father Bellamy hesitated. I remember whispers. The mother, Aimée, brought the child alone. There was no mention of the father and no return address. She was nervous, scared even. She gave a donation and left before I could ask much. Did she take the child with her? No, said the priest softly. The baby remained, left with a note asking that she be cared for and not returned to her family. Within a week, she was adopted. Poirot's brows arched. Adopted by whom? Father Bellamy consulted a register and produced a page with faded ink. Adoptive parent, Marguerite Gray. Widow. Mrs. Gray was childless, lived alone on the edge of Bow. She took Clara in, changed her surname. I lost track of them after 1905. Poirot studied the entry for a long time. Merci, mon père. As we departed, he looked up at the bell tower. There is no wound so deep, he said, as being erased. By late afternoon, we found a trace of Marguerite Gray's last known address. The house had long since been demolished, but a woman at the corner grocer's remembered the name. She had a boy, the woman said, quiet type, grew up strange, always watching things. Not quite right in the head, they said. Left town when he was barely grown. A name, Poirot asked. Simon, she said. Simon Gray. Poirot froze. Then he turned slowly. Simon, the biblical child who waits and is not chosen. That evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot stood before the fireplace. A map of London spread across the floor, pins and threads marking key points. St. Vincent's, Rue Montaigne, the Théâtre du Lys, but poured 2 brandies and handed one to him, this Simon Gray. Do you think he's the man from the theater? I believe he is the man from the fog, the man who signed his message with no one. Poirot sipped his brandy. He is not mad, Hastings. He is forgotten, and that is a powerful madness of its own. There was a knock at the door. Miss Sue 28. Lemon appeared with a telegram. Poirot opened it, eyes narrowing as he read, Reginald Venn found unconscious in office stop theater. Ransacked. Stop nothing stolen. Stop Poirot. Folded the message. It has begun, he said quietly. We reached the Théâtre du Lys in under 20 minutes. The fog had thickened once again, cloaking the street lamps in a strange golden aura. Inside, the theater was dim and cold. Police milled about, speaking in hushed tones. Reginald Venn lay on a couch backstage, a bandage around his temple, a constable at his side. He stirred as we entered. "I didn't see him," Venn whispered. "He came through the back, said he was looking for someone, then darkness." "Did he say a name?" Poirot asked. Venn nodded weakly. "Clara," he whispered. Poirot turned. To the constable, "Search the building, every corridor, every stair. He may still be inside." We followed the constables through the theater's depths, through costume rooms, prop closets, behind the stage flats. And then, in the upper wings, we found it. A second message, drawn in chalk across the stage floorboards, letters crooked, yet unmistakable. "Je suis le miroir. I am the mirror." Poirot stared at the writing. "No one sees themselves clearly," he murmured. "But he believes he does." He turned to me, voice low. "Simon Gray is no longer looking for answers, Hastings. He believes he is the answer." "Then what will he do?" Poirot's face was grim. "He will return to the woman he believes owes him a life. And Celeste?" Poirot looked me full in the face. "She is no longer a performer in this story. Hastings, she is its final scene." Chapter 6. The Mirror Cracks. By the following morning, the fog had not lifted. Instead, it had thickened, pressing against the window panes of Whitehaven mansions like a woolen veil soaked in cold water. London had gone silent beneath its smothering weight, and it felt to me as though the entire city was holding its breath. Poirot stood at his window, unmoving, a silhouette framed in gray. His gaze was not on the street below, but on something only he could see, something unspoken, unresolved. "It is almost time," he said at last. I looked up from the table where I had laid out a stack of notes and witness statements. Time for what? For the mirror to crack. He turned then and walked toward the desk, where he laid out the photograph Simon Gray had left. Aimée Laverne, the woman now known only through silence and resemblance, holding an infant that history had all but erased. Simon believes himself the son of this woman, the son abandoned, forgotten. He tapped the faded image. He has returned not to hurt Celeste Dulac, but to reclaim her. I stared at him. "You mean he thinks she is his sister?" Poirot said, "or something worse. He has lived in shadows, Hastings, in orphanages, in silence. He has imagined a story where she was spared, cherished, and he was thrown away." Poirot moved to the fireplace, the flames flickering, orange against the dark wool of his suit. "And now he seeks balance." There was a long silence between us. Then I asked, "You believe he will kill her?" Poirot's response was slow, deliberate. "No, not yet. His plan is not vengeance. It is correction. He wants her to see what he became, to choose him now, when she did not know him before." I shivered. "That's mad?" Poirot's voice was calm. "No, Hastings, it is personal." He walked to his coat stand. "I must go to the theater. There is one place Simon Gray would return to, one stage where he feels seen." I stood too. "You won't go alone." Poirot gave a smile. "Very well, mon ami, but stay close, and speak little." The Théâtre du Lys was shuttered for the day, a handwritten sign on the door reading "Closed for repairs." Poirot had arranged with Inspector Lawrence to have a constable stationed discreetly at the rear entrance. Inside, the main hall was dark, save for a shaft of dim light filtering through a tear in the velvet curtain. Celeste Dulac stood at center stage, rehearsing alone. She wore no costume, only a navy coat over a pale silk dress. Her voice, clear, mournful, rose faintly as she practiced a passage from her next production. Her eyes remained fixed on a single chair in the front row. Seat 3C. Poirot approached the edge of the stage, but did not interrupt her. When she finally turned and noticed us, she gave a small nod. "I thought you might come." "We had to be sure you were safe, madame," Poirot said. "There has been another intrusion." She closed her eyes briefly. "I know." Poirot stepped forward. "You saw him?" She nodded. "Last night, after the constables had gone, I returned to retrieve my script. I found him in the hallway, standing beneath the gaslight. He didn't speak. He only held out his hand." "What did you do?" "I ran." Poirot sighed. "He will not vanish, madame. You must face him, with us beside you." Celeste looked down at her hands, clasped tightly. "What does he want from me?" Poirot replied gently. "To be remembered, to be chosen, and perhaps to be forgiven." A sound echoed through the theater then, a soft click, as of a door closing far off stage. Poirot turned sharply. "That was from the upper gallery," he said. He signaled to Hastings, and we moved, carefully into the wings, leaving Celeste on stage as if she were unaware of our presence. Poirot signaled the constable to remain at the lobby entrance, and moved silently up the narrow staircase that led to the lighting rig and catwalk above the stage. There, crouched in shadow, was Simon Gray. He was hunched beside the spotlight housing, pale eyes fixed on Celeste through a break in the curtain. He did not turn as Poirot approached. "She looks like her," he said softly. "The same mouth, the same hair when it's not pinned, the same hands." Poirot didn't answer at first, then gently, "You watched her grow up from afar." "I saw her once," Simon murmured. "When I was 16, I followed her and her mother through Kensington Gardens. She laughed, I thought. Perhaps she would remember me." He paused. She didn't. Poirot stepped closer. "Your mother, Aimée Laverne, she made a choice, one that wounded you." But Celeste did not know. Simon's voice rose, not with anger, but with something more brittle. "She wore the locket. She wore her face, like a crown. She was everything I was not, and she never wondered why." Poirot was still now, his hands folded. "You wanted to remind her. I wanted her to see." Poirot said, "And if she does?" Simon looked at him then, truly looked, for the first time, eyes brimming with something childlike and raw. "Then I'll stop," he whispered. Below, Celeste moved across the stage, unaware of the two figures above. Poirot said softly, "Come down. Speak with her." Simon hesitated. Then slowly, silently, he rose. We waited in the wings as Poirot led Simon down the narrow staircase. Celeste stood in the center of the stage as the man approached, and for a moment it was as if a strange scene were playing out, unscripted, uncertain. Poirot stood to the side, watching closely. Simon paused a few paces from her, then, with shaking hands, he reached into his coat and withdrew something small, the other half of the cameo, the missing fragment. He extended it silently. Celeste took it, eyes wide. She looked up at him, and suddenly, perhaps impossibly, she smiled. "Remember now," she said quietly. "A photograph in my mother's drawer, a name, Simon." He said nothing, only nodded. The silence was long. Then Poirot stepped forward. "This is not the end, Simon," he said, "but it need not be destruction. Come with us, let the truth be spoken." Simon looked down. He nodded, and at last the mirror cracked, not with violence, but with understanding. Chapter 7: Ghosts in the Wings. For the first time in weeks, the Théâtre de Lys fell quiet. Not the expectant silence of a curtain about to rise, but the hush of something that had already ended. After Simon Gray's unexpected surrender, and Celeste Dulac's quiet acknowledgement of his connection, the immediate danger seemed to ebb. Inspector Lawrence arranged for Simon's temporary care at a private hospital near Richmond, where he was to undergo observation under gentle supervision rather than a cold cell. I would have thought Poirot satisfied. And yet, when I joined him the next morning at breakfast, I found him deep in contemplation, seated with his back straight, fingers laced beneath his chin. He hadn't touched his toast. He was not even reading the paper. A most unusual thing. "You're troubled," I said, pouring his tea. Poirot blinked and smiled faintly. "Mon ami, you know me too well. Is it Simon? Surely he is no longer a threat." "Ah, but threat is like perfume, Hastings. It lingers after the wearer has gone." He stood and crossed to the mantel where the photograph of Aimé Lavergne still rested beside the broken pieces of the Cameo. "I have been considering the fragments," said, "and the message left behind, 'Je suis le miroir,' I am the mirror." I nodded. "You think Simon wrote it?" Poirot paused. "Do I? That is the question. It sounds like Simon. The metaphor fits, but the execution," he gestured toward the notes we had collected. Simon's earlier messages, to Asmenti, Souvenir, were brief, emotional, almost childlike. But this one, it is calculated, symbolic, as though staged for maximum effect. I frowned. "You're suggesting someone else left it?" Poirot nodded. "I believe Simon was manipulated. Not into action, perhaps, but into timing. Someone stirred his pain to life again. Someone who knew the Cameo would be a symbol. Who knew Celeste's family history? Who waited until the moment the theater was most exposed? And who would do such a thing?" Poirot's face grew solemn. "That, Hastings, is what we must discover." We returned to the theater that afternoon. The scent of polish lingered in the lobby, and a cleaning crew moved quietly through the aisles, dusting the velvet chairs. The place no longer felt ominous, but faded, like an actor after the spotlight has gone out. Poirot requested access once again to Celeste Dulac's dressing room. There he spent nearly half an hour studying the drawer, the lock, and the cracks in the paneling behind the mirror. He measured with a silver ruler, paced to the far corner, then turned sharply. "I thought so," he said. He crouched and pressed gently against one section of the wall. With a click, a small panel gave way. A narrow space, perhaps 2 feet wide, opened behind the wall, just enough for a person to squeeze through. "A hidden corridor," I said. "You were right." Poirot peered inside. A small stool was tucked neatly into the corner, as though someone had sat there in secret. "Someone has been watching her," Poirot said. "Not just recently, for some time." I felt a cold ripple up my spine. "You think Simon came here?" "No," Poirot replied. "Simon Gray would have burst into her life, not hidden in the walls. This was someone else, someone theatrical, someone with a taste for slow revelation." Poirot examined the walls inside the alcove. Faint pencil markings were scrawled along the wooden beam, small sketches, an eye, a rose, a locket split in half. "And yet," he said softly, "these are not the drawings of a man plotting revenge. They are the symbols of memory." He turned back. "We must speak with Evelyn Ingram." We found Miss Ingram in the costume department, adjusting a delicate lace collar for her upcoming role in The Lovers of Florence. Her hair was tied in a bun, her cheeks flushed with exertion. She straightened when she saw us. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "is everything all right?" "For now," he said, "but I would like to ask you a question." "Without pretense, mademoiselle." She nodded. Poirot stepped closer. "Do you know who Simon Gray is?" Evelyn's lips parted. She hesitated just a second too long. I've heard the name. That is not what I asked." She flushed, then looked down. "I knew someone was hiding in the theater," she said softly. "I saw him once, weeks ago, slipping into the east corridor. I didn't tell anyone. I thought maybe it was a squatter, or someone obsessed with Celeste." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You didn't think to mention it. She faltered. "I suppose I thought it was romantic." "Romantic? Not the danger, but the mystery. This man watching from the shadows, fixated on someone so far above him. It felt like a story." Poirot's voice sharpened. "A story you helped shape." Her eyes widened. "No, I never spoke to him. You leave the message on the stage. Je suis le miroir." She shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't. I swear it." Poirot watched her a long moment. Then he softened. "I believe you, but someone else has been here longer than we imagined." He turned away. "There is one more person we have not questioned properly." I looked at him. Claude Marchand. Claude Marchand was in the green room, seated with a newspaper in one hand and a brandy in the other. His dark eyes flicked up. As we entered, "If this is another inquiry about Celeste's lost cameo, I fear I've nothing more to add." Poirot approached him. "And yet you always seem to be present, monsieur. Always near the door she enters, always the last to leave rehearsal, always watching." Marchand arched a brow. "I admire her." "Is that a crime?" "You admired her. Mother, too, did you not?" Marchand's expression froze. Poirot continued, voice like a blade. "You knew Aimée Laverne. Years ago, before the war, she performed in Marseille. You followed her then." "That was a lifetime ago," Marchand said softly. "And when she left the stage, you followed her daughter." Poirot drew from his pocket a small card, aged and brittle. It bore Marchand's name, scrawled beside a booking from Théâtre de l'Étoile, 1902. "You were there the week Clara was born." Marchand's hands tightened. "I never touched that child." "I do not say you did," Poirot replied. "But you knew. You knew Aimée had a child she would never acknowledge. You knew Celeste's cameo was of her mother. And when Simon Gray began lurking near the theater, you nudged him. I did no such thing. You did not have to. You merely left the het door ajar. A name whispered here. A letter slipped there. A story encouraged." Poirot's voice dropped. "You watched a tragedy unfold, not as villain, but as audience. And now, monsieur, the curtain falls for you." That evening, Claude Marchand quietly resigned from the Théâtre du Lys. No charges were brought, but he left London with nothing, not his reputation, not his contracts, and, most notably, not Celeste Dulac's forgiveness. Poirot watched from the shadows of the theater steps as Marchand vanished into a cab. He thought himself a playwright, he murmured, but he played only with lives. I turned to him. "Is it over?" Poirot looked to the theater door. Almost. He held the final fragment of the shattered cameo between his fingers. One last piece to restore. Chapter 8. The Last Letter. The next day brought sunlight at last. It streamed through the windows of Whitehaven mansions with uncommon warmth, glinting off the brass trimmings and dancing faintly across Poirot's polished silver teapot. Yet the brightness did little to lighten the mood within. Poirot sat at his desk, once more examining the photograph of Aimé Laverne. Now, beside it, lay the nearly complete cameo, its ivory pieces reassembled like a puzzle of memory. Only one fragment remained missing, and Poirot, I could see, believed it was more than a shard of ivory. It was the piece that made the entire picture clear. At length he turned to me. "We are so close, Hastings, so close to the truth, and yet we still circle the final answer like a dancer avoiding the center of the stage." I stirred my tea. "I thought Claude Marchand was the last obstacle." Poirot nodded slowly. He was the hand that nudged Simon forward, but he was not the architect. The motivations, the guilt, the shame, all that began before Marchand even returned to London. He tapped the photograph. It began with Aimé Laverne, and it must end with her as well. It was nearly noon when Poirot requested we visit Madame Dulac once more. She had, since the encounter with Simon, secluded herself in her townhouse, avoiding the theater and the press that had begun to whisper about a mysterious admirer and a scandal behind the curtain. We found her in her drawing room, seated by the window with a half-read book in her lap. Her face was pale, but her voice calm. "I've tried to remember more," she said softly, before we even sat down. About my mother, her past, the stories she would tell, so many unfinished. Poirot smiled gently. Sometimes the mind does not forget. It merely waits for the right moment to remember. She hesitated, then reached into a small keepsake box on the table beside her. From it she withdrew a folded envelope, worn with age and brittle at the corners. I found this behind a drawer in her vanity. I don't think she meant for it to be read. Poirot accepted it with reverent care. He unfolded the paper slowly and read to my daughter, "Should she ever need the truth, you were not my first." There was another. His name was Simon, and he was born of a love that turned to fear. I gave him away because I could not see a life for him in a world where his father held sway. He was kind, that child, quiet. I wept for him until my tears ran dry, but I never searched again. Not because I did not care, but because I feared what he would become without me. Forgive me. Amy Poirot folded the letter and placed it back into Celeste's hands. She feared her own failure, said, and so she buried it. Celeste stared at the page as if it were still speaking. "I don't know what to do with this," she whispered. "It changes everything." "No," Poirot said quietly. "It explains everything." "That is not the same." She looked up, her voice trembling. "He's still out there, Simon. He could return. Ask for more." Poirot shook his head. "He won't. You have already given him what he sought. Acknowledgement, truth. His story no longer belongs to the shadows." Celeste was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Will you tell the police everything?" Poirot considered the question with a gravity I had seen many times before. Then, slowly, "No, there is no crime left to punish. No law that can account for grief unspoken." She exhaled as if a great weight had finally loosened from her chest. We left her townhouse in silence. As we stepped into the late afternoon, I said, "You're certain Simon won't try to contact her again?" Poirot gave a small nod. He has found his answer. He came not to harm, but to be seen. And Celeste saw him, not as a stranger, but as something she had never named. He paused at the end of the street, then gestured to a corner postbox. "There is one thing I must do, Hastings." He withdrew an envelope of his own from his coat and slid it into the post. On the back was a single word: Clara. "To Simon?" I asked. "No," Poirot said. "To the name he never got to keep." That evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot returned to his desk and carefully placed the final fragment of the shattered cameo, the piece retrieved from Simon's coat pocket, into its place. The figure was complete now, a woman in profile, noble and solemn. But at her shoulder, with a faint smile and arms wrapped loosely around her neck, was a second face, barely distinguishable. "A child!" I gasped. "It was never just her," I said. "The carving was of mother and child." Poirot nodded. "The truth was always there, mon ami, just in pieces." He stood and moved to the window, where the night had finally fallen clear, over London. No fog, no shadow. I asked, "Do you think Celeste will return to the stage?" "She will," Poirot said, "but she will no longer act from memory. She will perform with knowledge." He paused. "That is what separates tragedy from farce, Hastings. A play is farce when none of the characters know what they're doing. It becomes tragedy when they do, and still cannot change the end." Said nothing, letting his words hang in the stillness. At last, Poirot turned back and extinguished the lamp. "Come," he said, "the performance is over." And though the curtain had not yet fallen in the Théâtre du Lys, I knew, beyond any doubt, that the mystery of the shattered cameo had played its final note. Chapter 9, A Truth in Ivory, in the morning that followed our visit to Madame Dulac. I found Poirot already packed for travel. His small leather valise closed, his gloves folded neatly beside his cane, and his mustache waxed with a precision that only signaled one thing: resolution was coming. "They have written to the executor of Marguerite Gray's estate," he said, handing me my overcoat. "She, you will recall, was the woman who adopted Clara Laverne." I blinked. But Simon Gray, Poirot raised a finger, assumed he was that child. He was adopted by Mrs. Gray. But what if he was not the only one? I stopped short. "Believe there were two children." "I believe," Poirot said with a quiet note of finality, "that the truth is more complicated than Simon ever knew." We took the early train to Harrow, where Mrs. Gray had lived until her death 2 years prior, in a weathered stone cottage tucked at the edge of a lane called Bellman's Hollow. Her estate had been modest, but the solicitor, one Mr. Edwin Latchley, had agreed to meet us at his chambers on short notice, intrigued by the name Herculepoirot, and evidently fond of a mystery. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Gray," Latchley said as he poured tea with an unsteady hand. A stern woman, to be sure, sharp as a thorn, but kind underneath. No living family when she passed. Left the cottage and its contents to the church, Poirot nodded politely. "Monsieur, you have access to her adoption records." "I do," he said, opening a green metal file box and drawing out a yellowing folder. "She formerly adopted one child through St. Vincent's in 1902. Name of Clara Laverigne. She renamed her Clara Gray." Poirot raised a brow. "Clara? Not Simon?" Latchley shook his head. "No, sir. Simon came later, informally, around 1909, found wandering near Spitalfields, thin as bone, barely speaking. She took him in, but he was never legally registered under her name." Poirot's eyes glinted, So Clara was real. Yes, but she died, I'm afraid, in 1910, scarlet fever. I felt my breath hitch. So Simon wasn't her biological child, not to my knowledge, said Latchley. She always treated them both as her own, but she referred to them differently. Clara as her daughter, Simon as her poor stray. Never cruelly, just precisely. Poirot sat very still, his gaze distant. "Merci, monsieur," he said at last. "You have given me the final piece." As we left the solicitor's office, I turned to Poirot, stunned. Simon believed he was the child of Aimé Lavergne. He thought the cameo was of his mother. Poirot nodded. But it wasn't. Clara Lavergne, Celeste's older sister, was real. The carving depicted both Aimé and Clara. The cameo was of family heirloom kept in mourning. But Simon found the locket. He saw the likeness in Celeste. He assumed. He built a story from fragments, Hastings. A child abandoned, raised in silence, desperate for a history. And when he found Clara's old documents, perhaps after Mrs. Gray died, he believed they were his. I exhaled slowly. But they weren't. No, Poirot said softly. They belonged to a sister who died before she could even be known. A girl whose name was carved in ivory and hidden away. And Celeste, she never knew. Correct. Aimé kept Clara's existence secret, even from her second daughter. Perhaps out of guilt. Perhaps to protect her new family. But in doing so, she denied Simon the one thing he needed. "Truth," I murmured. Poirot paused on the stone path, gazing toward a tree-lined churchyard at the edge of Harrow. "Yes," he said, "and that is the greatest cruelty." Back in London, Poirot sent a final letter. To Simon, still under gentle care in the hospital at Richmond. The letter was short, honest, and clear. Simon Gray, you were cared for, though not by the mother you imagined. Mrs. Margaret Gray took you in with compassion, not out of blood, but of conscience. The child of Aimé Lavergne, Clara, died in 1910. The cameo you shattered was not of your mother, but of your sister and hers. You were not born of that family, but you became part of its echo. The pain you feel is real, but it was never betrayal. It was a mistake of time, silence, and longing. I hope you find peace in knowing the truth. Hercule Poirot. He sealed the envelope and handed it to me without a word. Then, finally, he returned to his chair and allowed himself a sigh. It is done. Hastings. I sat across from him, absorbing the weight of it. He believed himself a mirror, I said, but he was only looking for his reflection in others. Poirot smiled faintly. As do we all, mon ami. That evening, we were surprised by a knock at the door. It was Celeste Dulac. She stood in the threshold, wrapped in a navy coat, her hands trembling only slightly. She held something wrapped in a handkerchief. Poirot rose. I didn't know who else to give it to, she said. She stepped forward and unwrapped the handkerchief, revealing the restored cameo, its ivory glinting faintly in the lamplight. I cannot wear it, she said softly, but it should not be buried. Poirot accepted it with both hands, as reverently as if it were a sacred relic. It will be kept safe. She lingered a moment longer. Do you believe he'll understand, Simon? She nodded. Poirot said, I believe he already does. She offered a small, tired smile. Then she turned and vanished into the London night. Later, as we sat in silence, Poirot placed the cameo in a small wooden box, locking it with a key before tucking it into his desk drawer. There, he said. A story made whole. I looked out the window, where the stars had returned to London at last. And what kind of story was it? Poirot leaned back. A tragedy, rewritten, not erased, but retold. He closed his eyes. Justice does not always wear a robe, Hastings. Sometimes it wears remembrance. Chapter 10. Curtain Call. The final curtain did not fall with applause, but with silence. It had been nearly a week since Celeste Dulac handed over the restored Cameo to Poirot. A gift of closure, perhaps, or surrender. The city had since returned to its natural rhythm. The theaters buzzed once more with anticipation and gossip. Newspapers had moved on to newer scandals. The fog, though it returned in the evenings, no longer lingered like a shroud. And yet, something had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. Poirot had resumed his usual routines, meticulous breakfasts, tidy strolls, and his daily polish of the silver-backed hairbrush on the mantel. But I noticed his moments of reflection lasted longer. He would pause by the window with a thoughtful frown, or stand before his desk, as if waiting for a voice that had ceased speaking. On a bright Tuesday morning, I returned from the post with a letter marked from Richmond. "It's from Simon," I said. Poirot took it gently and opened it with deliberate care. The note inside was brief. "Monsieur Poirot, I do not know who I am, but I know now who I am not. That is something. I dream less, I speak more, I sometimes smile. I will never thank you. But I will remember you, no one." Poirot folded the letter, set it on the edge of the desk, and remained silent for some time. Then, quietly, "It is enough." I offered no reply. I sensed none was needed. That afternoon we returned once more to the Théâtre du Lys. Madame Dulac had sent us invitations to the premiere of her new production, La Dame Perdue, a poetic tragedy of loss and rediscovery, newly adapted for the stage. The theater had been restored to full glamour. Fresh roses adorned the lobby. The chandeliers glittered as they had not in years, and a hush of reverence filled the space like a held breath. As we took our seats, front row this time, I glanced toward 3C. It remained empty. Poirot, noticing my look, smiled faintly. "Some chairs must remain unoccupied, Hastings. They are the ghosts we make peace with." The lights dimmed. The curtain rose, and there she was, Celeste Dulac, transformed once more into someone else, and yet more herself than I had ever seen her. Her voice filled the theater, warm and wounded as the play began, but for all its beauty, my attention drifted. I watched Poirot as he watched the stage, not as a critic, but as someone searching for harmony after dissonance. He leaned forward only once, during a moment in which the heroine placed a broken locket on a windowsill and walked away from it. Later, when the curtain fell and the applause thundered, Poirot did not stand. He clapped quietly, politely, but his mind, I knew, had already turned inward. After the performance, we were invited backstage. The green room buzzed with congratulations, laughter, and bouquets handed from stranger to stranger. Celeste stood, alone by the mirror, gently dabbing at the corner of her eyes with a handkerchief. She turned as we approached. "You came," she said simply. "You were magnificent," I told her. She smiled, tired and grateful. "I didn't perform," I remembered. Poirot nodded. "You remembered well, madam, and in doing so, you gave voice to those who were never heard." She grew quiet. "Do you believe he'll come back?" "Seaman?" Poirot shook his head. "No, he has taken his final bow. He will live now in a place where he need not perform." She studied her reflection. Do you think he would have been kind? Poirot considered this. I think he already was. A long silence passed. Then Celeste reached into her coat pocket and removed a sealed envelope. "This arrived this morning," she said. "No return address, no handwriting, just this." Handed it to Poirot. He opened it. Inside was a sketch, a pencil drawing on coarse paper. It was of the Théâtre du Lys, but not as it was now, as it once had been, less polished, a little crooked, but unmistakably loved, and seated in the third row, alone, was a figure holding a carnation. No message, no name, just memory. Poirot returned the envelope to her. "Frame it," he said softly, "but not for the stage, for your home." She nodded, tears not quite fallen in her eyes. We left the theatre and walked the quiet streets of London, the gas lamps flickering faintly in the twilight. Neither of us spoke for some time. Finally, I said, "It's a curious thing, Poirot. So many cases. You've solved thieves, murderers, blackmailers, but this one—" He smiled. "This one had no criminal, only pain. And yet," I said, "you pursued it with the same precision." Poirot gave a small nod. "Because the greatest mysteries, Hastings, are not in what people do, but why they do it." He turned to me. Seaman was not evil. He was fractured, raised in silence. He created meaning where none had been offered. That is how people survive, mon ami, by inventing their past when truth is denied. We paused at the corner of Whitehaven Mansions. I looked at him. "Did you pity him, Poirot?" Smiled faintly. "I respected him." We ascended the steps, entered the flat, and as he always did after a case, Poirot walked to his desk and removed the case file. He wrote in fine script the title across the front, "The Case of the Shattered Cameo." Then he closed the folder. "I shall not publish this one," he said. "No," he shook his head. "This is a tale that belongs to those who lived it. Let the public read of murders and motives. This story was not for spectacle. It was for remembrance." He opened the drawer and placed the file inside, beside the sealed wooden box that held the cameo. I turned to him. "Will you keep the locket?" "For now," he said, "until it is forgotten naturally, not by force, but by peace." The clock struck 10. Poirot rose and began preparing his tisane. He looked toward me once more. "We chase truth, Hastings, always. But when we find it, we must also let it rest." I nodded slowly, and as the night deepened, and the lights of the city, I knew, as surely as I knew the ticking of that clock, that this story had not ended with a culprit in handcuffs, or a gunshot in the deep dark. It had ended instead with something rarer understanding, and for Hercule Poirot, that most precise and logical of men, perhaps that was the finest justice of all.